My name's Lizzie Starkey. I'm a consultant paediatrician in Derby and assistant officer for trainer development. And thank you all for coming to one of our educational supervisor virtual roadshows. And this is all about more practical stuff as supervisors with regards to the ePortfolio. We know that obviously the trainees use their ePortfolio on hopefully a daily basis, but a regular basis. And as supervisors, sometimes we struggle with it, and we wanted to put on a slightly smaller roadshow, shorter length, looking at the ePortfolio with some tips on how to use it. So I'm really pleased to invite Michaela from the college, and she is going to talk to us a bit, initially some of the practical aspects of the portfolio, and then I am going to probably give it, I am going to give a session more from a sort of a consultant perspective on practical things that I think are useful.
So I'm going to cover a few things. I'm going to go through some of the ePortfolio functions, reports and PDPs, goals, and some of the other forms that might be new to you all as supervisors. So first thing, I'll just move that out of the way. We get a lot of queries from supervisors who can't see their trainee anymore. 99% of the time, this is because the trainee has not added you. So they need to add the training post with supervisor link to cover the whole of the supervision period. And usually the supervision period is set up for 6 months. And so they need to do this every 6 months. And they can also add a supplementary training post with supervisor link if their details have changed mid-grade. For example, if they're an ST1 and their second 6-month rotation, they have a different supervisors, they would need to add the supplementary training post. Another reason you may not be able to see your trainee is that they may have added you as an incorrect role. So if you are a trainee's ES, just make sure that they've not added you as a clinical supervisor, because all the forms are role dependent and you would not be able to see, you would not be able to complete an educational supervisor trainer report if they have added you as their clinical supervisor. So I'll talk now a little bit, let me just expand this actually, bear with me a moment. So I'll talk a little bit about roles. As a supervisor, you may also have different roles on the ePortfolio. So on your dashboard at the top left, you'll see here where it says supervisor, there's a little arrow. That brings up this drop-down menu where you can switch between any other roles that you may have. Just make sure that you're logged in as supervisor, so you've got all the supervisor functions and can see all the announcements and things like that. It's there at the top left corner of your dashboard. So I'll talk a bit about reports. The first thing to mention is that all supervisor reports are trainee-led. I'm sure you know that. It means that you can't start them. I know you can with other ePortfolio systems, but with Kaizen, the trainee has to create the forms themselves. So each rotation, a trainee should complete the induction meeting with PDP, which sets the SMART goals for their rotation. That can only be completed by the educational supervisor. There is a form for the clinical induction, clinical supervisor induction, but this does not set the goals, so it can't be used in place of a PDP. So the ESTR, the Supervision Report for Educational Supervisors, this is designed to be used before ARCP and needs to be completed at least once a year or as directed by deanery, because sometimes they do have different requirements depending on which deanery you're in. This form can be used as an end of placement report, but it's far more in depth. It's not just a summary of their progress. It's very in depth and focuses on everything. If an ARCP is not imminent, you can use the placement reflection discussion, which is far less in depth, but it would not be appropriate when an ARCP is imminent. So the joint educational and clinical supervisor report is the same as the ESTR, but has an area for the clinical supervisor feedback as well. So this can only be used when the trainee has the same educational and clinical supervisor. If they're different people, then the trainee should complete the ESTR and the clinical supervisor trainer reports separately. So the clinical supervisor report is essentially the end of placement form with the CS. And then finally, the midpoint review. This is not mandated, but can be useful, particularly with trainees in difficulty, to review a trainee's progress midway through a post. So I thought I'd talk a little bit about these two forms because both of them are fairly new to the ePortfolio. The ECAT, it's a formative assessment and it's designed to get feedback on their trainee activities from the Tier 2 rota. And it's essentially reassuring the trainee that they've met the requirements for stepping up. And as it says here, it assesses whether they can undertake activity without supervision or whether they're not quite ready to do that yet. There's also the readiness for Tier 2 rota, but this only becomes necessary when somebody is going to be acting up before they finish ST3. Otherwise, the decision is made by the ARCP panel on whether they move up. It can also be used at the end of ST3 if a supervisor wants to highlight any development needs of the trainee. So hopefully that's straightforward enough. We've also installed a new ARCP preparation form. So this came about because we noticed that many trainees were creating folders full of documents that aren't sitting on the ePortfolio in their document library. So this form brings together all of those things that the ARCP panel need to see at ARCP. So that pulls together the trainee life supports, confirmation, child protection, and the Form R. So that's where you would check for all of those things in the ARCP preparation form. So a little bit about the checklists. I know this has been very confusing for trainees and probably some supervisors as well. We've installed checklists for each grade and also level checklists. So there's level 1, 2, 3. Just to clarify, these only present information that is already on the ePortfolio. So whereby previously you would have had to check in the timeline that they had completed things like their MSF. It will still be in the timeline. It's just that these checklists make it a little bit easier so you can see without trawling through lots and lots of additional assessments. Trainees can't link to them. They should automatically populate once the trainee has done it. If they are not populating, it's usually because the trainee has not added a training post, or they have completed a different form and think that they've completed this one, or sometimes that the form they completed was outside, for example, of their grade. If they completed something in ST1 and then now in ST2, that's obviously not going to pull through to their ST2 checklist. So you don't need to do anything to sign these checklists off. They're purely there for information purposes. So to make it easier for you, you can still check in the timeline if something is showing as 0%, and just check there to make sure it's not hidden away and it's not pulling through correctly. But just to reiterate that you don't need to do anything. It's only a different way of presenting information that exists on the ePortfolio already. So goals, PDP and curricula. Everything is kind of goal-based now on the ePortfolio. The PDP is created, as you know, as part of the ES induction meeting. It's located in the goals section. So on when you look at a trainee timeline, you'll see something like this screenshot here. If you click into the goals, that brings up all of the goals that they've got going. So you can see a PDP section, one for the curriculum, and perhaps they're doing a spin. And if they're a level 3 trainee, their start PDP might also feature there. It's not in the screenshot, but it may also be there. With the PDP, new goals can be added. So if they have an existing PDP and you don't want to create a new one, or it's not appropriate to create a brand new one, you can also add goals to an existing PDP. So the trainee own their PDP and they can mark it as achieved once they feel that they have addressed the learning need that was outlined in them. Conversely, however, the start PDP needs to be signed off by educational supervisors. And so I'll go into a little bit about that next. So here we can see the start PDP. You've accessed it from the goals section. First of all, you need to click into that. You'll then see each one of the goals that are set out, and these are all hyperlinks. So you would just need to click into each one of these, which would bring up this page here with a button to mark goal as. I would recommend you only mark goal as achieved. If it's not achieved, don't worry about putting carried forward or not achieved, because then the trainee cannot see the numbers anymore. It will mark it and they'll only be able to see the response that you've put. So only mark them as achieved when you need to at the end of each level, and not before then, because otherwise it means that it's in progress anyway. So here again, I've just outlined what I discussed earlier. So the curriculum goals, which you can see on a trainee dashboard, you only need to sign these off at the end of a level. Don't worry about marking them as partially achieved. So you can sign these off from the dashboard, as I just showed you, from the report section, or you can go directly into the supervision report. I'm sorry, there was just a bit of an echo there. Sorry. So ePortfolio and Progress Plus, I'm sure a lot of you are interested in how it's going to look. The Progress Plus build is underway on the ePortfolio, and information will be added to the trainee and supervisor dashboards. Please do check announcements that are added to your ePortfolio. You'll see something like this on this kind of nice peachy coloured screenshot here, letting you know you've got announcements. So we'll put all the information you need in there. Trainees are going to be self-selecting their correct grade from the drop-down menu. And just for your information, I've also added this helpful slide here, which kind of indicates the different grades that trainee might be, whether they're remaining in core, whether they're moving on to specialty training. So these slides can be shared with you afterwards as well. So if something isn't working, I put the owl because you're all very wise people, but even wise people may have questions sometimes. We're really happy to help. Just contact training.services@rcpch.ac.uk.
So obviously Michaela has given us a talk on sort of the practice, sort of the how to do things and all the sort of things that I think supervisors asked me when I was a college tutor, but also as a TPD and as a colleague, as someone who knows a bit about the ePortfolio. They're always the things that crop up. So thank you for that, Michaela. From my perspective, I'm just going to put a bit more of a sort of supervisor sort of thought to it. What I'm hoping that we'll do today, and we can open it up for questions a bit later if anyone's got any real burning questions, but we're going to think about the role of the educational supervisor with regards to the portfolio. One of the things that Progress was designed to do is making the supervisor getting rid of the tick box for the trainees and thinking about the evidence that they're putting in their portfolio, showing their learning and development and meeting the requirements. So it does involve the educational supervisor having a look at that evidence. And I think that's one of the important parts of Progress and Progress Plus. So thinking about quality of the evidence in a trainee's portfolio as their supervisor, rather than the quantity. And I think we're now starting to see, well, I am locally anyway, trainees maybe not putting in lots of things, but those things that they are putting in their portfolio of more significant quality. And I think it's really important that you know your curriculum and that you know that what the trainees need to be doing so that you can support them in this role and support them as they go through their training. So we talk about this in the Effective Educational Supervision course, and if anyone hasn't done that, I would recommend that you do, or if you need a refresher, it's a great course to do. But it's important to think about reviewing your trainees' portfolios so that you know what it looks like. And that's knowing that you've got access to it, which is one of the questions that Michaela answered earlier, is really important, because you don't want to end up going to your meeting and not have access to your trainees' portfolio, because really you should be doing some of this work in advance of seeing them. So one of the first things that I do if I get a new educational supervisor, supervisee I should say, is look at their previous ARCP outcome. Now actually that's not necessarily what you need to do just for an educational supervisor. You should be doing that as a clinical supervisor as well, because it might show you some of the areas that trainee needs to learn and develop from, and that's really important, because it might be where the previous ARCP panel has recommended some things that a trainee needs to work on, and therefore you need to know that information. Obviously, if you're longitudinally supervising a trainee, then some of this stuff is less relevant to do every time. But you need to be thinking about what previous posts they've done, what training level they're at, so that you can gauge what needs to be done. If this is an ST1, then obviously they're not going to have anything in their portfolio necessarily. They may do if they've done a non-training post and use the ePortfolio, but it's important just to have a look at what's already there and what training level that they're at. Reviewing their previous reports and clinical supervisor reports, again, is a requirement. What are you gauging from this trainee? How are they getting on? Are there any concerns? What areas do they need to focus on? Looking at their previous assessments, their developmental log. Now, I love this wheel. I've noticed that when I've looked at trainees' portfolios recently, that the wheel has gone from some of the portfolios, but I use that as a really good way of seeing that they're using their developmental log to evidence their curriculum. And then obviously reviewing the curriculum goals is really important, because that's where their learning outcome, how they achieve their training basically, and you need to be going through each of the learning outcomes and looking at what areas have they achieved in, what areas do they need to work on, have they got a good range and breadth of things that you can see. This all takes time, and I think we probably as educational supervisors need to make more time if we can. I know that's really difficult, but that's what to do the best thing that we can as a supervisor. We need to take the time to look at the trainees' portfolio, and I think also regularly reviewing how they're doing is also important. This is one of the things that I sit on ARCP panels and chair them, and regularly the thing that we talk about a lot is multi-tagging, or some areas call it spray tagging. And that's basically where a trainee has used one developmental log or one assessment and linked it to many areas of the curriculum. And this only comes up, and you can see it on the slide, the red bit that says this is linked to 7 other targets. I think it's something that needs discussing with trainees. I've seen one thing being linked to over 60 different curriculum, and you've got to then say to that trainee, hang on a minute, you're you're not quite getting the idea of this. This is about quality, not quantity. And it's not a tick box exercise. And how is this one piece of evidence linked to 60 different items, or even 8 other items? So sometimes it may be appropriate with an MSF, for example, but if they're doing it for every single developmental or what thing they've put in their curriculum, then that isn't appropriate and needs discussing with them. As I said, it's all about quality evidence, and as a supervisor your role is to look at that evidence and say whether it meets that key capability, and so sometimes it can be difficult to say, oh, does it meet it or not? And I think it's important to discuss that with the trainee. You know, 2 or 3 pieces of good quality evidence is much better in a learning outcome than having 50 or 60 that you can't see why it's linked to that key capability. I think having a really good reflective piece, or a quality improvement project that demonstrates lots of evidence, is much better than having lots of little things that don't necessarily link well. So thinking about reflection and learning within that, you know, just linking to a teaching session that they've been to with no evidence of any learning or reflection in it doesn't necessarily show that they've learned anything from it. So I think it's important to try and drill that down if you can. So I know that, we know that Michaela's talked to us about goals already. And this came in, I think it was a year or so ago, about the curriculum goals and signing them off. And I think some areas of the country have done a lot of work with supervisors about that. And in some areas it's less well known, and hence why we're talking about it. And if you want to look at how to do it, there's, on my slide, it's the YouTube video, but I think Anthony's going to put the link in the chat. It's a 5-minute YouTube video, so it's not very onerous to show you how to do it. But the curriculum goals is what needs to be achieved for a trainee to move between levels. So obviously at the moment we've got our 3 levels. From August, so in about 97 days time, we will be moving to 2 levels. But trainees need to be have everything in their learning outcomes achieved to move to the next level. That is the role of the educational supervisor. It's not the role of the ARCP, and we'll talk about that in a bit. You can sign trainees off in their educational supervisor report, and we'll talk about that again in a bit, but you can sign them off at any point. You don't need to wait till the end of a meeting. So if you're meeting your trainee regularly, maybe at their midpoint, and they've done something exceptional, or they've done something related to quality improvement that demonstrates they've achieved their quality improvement domain, then you can sign that off. And if they've partially achieved it and you want to sign that as partially achieved, you can, and you can write some comments in the box. And you can write some comments in the box if they've achieved it, saying how and why they've achieved it as well. As I said, you can sign these off as well from the educational supervisor report. So you can see in this slide there, this is part of the YouTube video actually, but marking off, they've written in the comments box why they've achieved it. So it's good to review, as I've already highlighted before, it's really good to review a trainee's evidence in advance of meeting with them. And that's particularly important when doing the educational supervisor report. So when thinking about the educational supervisor report, this is obviously the one that Michaela says is for ARCP. So that might be done if you might just do it once in the year, but you might be doing it twice depending on your region. Obviously, if you're just a clinical supervisor, we need a clinical supervisor report at the end of each of their placements, which need to go into that educational supervisor report. If you are the educational supervisor and the clinical supervisor, then you can do the one report. But I think it is important that as an educational supervisor, you have what the clinical supervisor's thoughts are before you meet your trainee, because you can't gauge that, know how they're doing clinically, particularly if you're in a different area, you're not working with that trainee. So I think I spend a long time looking at a trainee's portfolio before I see them, to see how they've got on, and I spend a reasonable length of time with them going through their end of education supervisor trainer report. It takes time, and you need to book in that time with that trainee, with your trainee. So you need to be thinking about their PDP. Have they managed the things on their goals? Are they working towards them? What evidence have they got to show that their PDP is achieved? The assessments, obviously using the Royal College Assessment Guide, and that does change every now and again, so you might want to look at it. It will be changing with Progress Plus a little bit. Have they done enough of their assessments? Are there any that are not quite there? And do they need to get them done before the end of a level? And are they of good quality? As I said, what has the clinical supervisor said about the trainee and how they're working? And what does their MSF say? Are there any bits that you need to pick up? Are there any learning and developmental points that you need to pick up? And what is their curriculum looking like? And that depends on where they are. If they're an ST1, obviously they've got a long way to go in that level. Whereas if they're currently an ST3 and they're at the end of their level, they need to be they need to be completing everything in their curriculum and linking to every key capability. As mentioned, good quality evidence, not just doing something and ticking it for ticking its sake. Are there any areas for development, or what are they doing really well and that you want to highlight that is a strength of theirs? Because it's important to highlight strengths of how trainees are doing. And can you, in that education supervisor report, sign off any learning outcomes? And you can click on the bit that says preview at the side, and then that will take you to the learning outcome that you want to sign off. As Michaela said, it's generated by the trainee. And many times you have to remind them of that fact. Yes, it's their responsibility to set up the meeting for you, with you and send you the report. However, you might need to gently remind them, particularly the more junior trainees who've never done this before. And it does need to be completed. The role of the educational supervisor is to say whether that trainee is meeting their requirements, has met their met their requirements for the level. That's not the role of the ARCP. The role of the ARCP is to take the view of the supervisor, review a trainee and sign that off. But it's not the role to say that they've achieved things. That should be done by the supervisor. It takes a couple of hours, I would say, to discuss that report with your trainee. So you need to make that time. And the reports, there are reports within it that can be pulled through to make the report look good. So the MSF, for example, any assessments can be pulled through, PDP goals can be pulled through to it. And you just need to make sure you click on that link that says create report, and then that will all be there. And then that makes the role of the ARCP panel easier. So if the supervisor has commented on every single domain and how they're doing, then you can get a good idea at the ARCP on how that trainee is progressing. So this is just a screenshot of what, so this is a screenshot of the education supervisor report that shows the evidence is in progress, but can you click on the preview button and say that this trainee is more than that? At the end of a training level, as I've said briefly before, a trainee needs to be completing all areas of their curriculum, using assessments, their developmental log, MSF, etc. to demonstrate that. And this, if people haven't seen this document called Preparing for ARCP, it is actually one of the most useful practical guides for trainees, supervisors and panels on knowing whether a trainee has met their requirements. These are just examples, but they're the sort of things that the college are expecting trainees to have done when to evidence to say they're meeting their requirements. There will be a new one coming out for Progress Plus when that comes out. One of the things I think that sometimes people fall down on as a supervisor is knowing which curriculum, and therefore if you're not sure which curriculums to do, you can't guide your trainee on what they should be doing and what should be in their portfolio. So just a brief reminder. So this is for level 3. You have your general paediatric syllabus, or you have your neonatal syllabus. Plus you have your level 3 generic syllabus. So at level 1 and 2 it's easy because you only have one, but you just need to remember to remind your trainee that it not to just focus on the generic, because they may have other areas to look at. I think this usually can be the general paediatric that sort of get fixated on spin potentially, and that might cause they sort of think about their spin and they sometimes forget the general paediatric specific learning outcomes, which are different to the generic ones that the 12 generic ones. When we go through to Progress Plus, obviously we have the core for paediatrics, which is going to be the ST1s to 4s, and then you will have the 5s to 7s will have the generic syllabus, and then they're either their general peds or their neonates, for example, as before. Michaela, so I've just added these slides that I have already, just to talk a bit more about the ECAT, because I know Michaela mentioned it, but it's basically an extension of an ACAT, so acute care assessment tool. This is an entrustment care tool, and it's basically a supervision of a trainee to show that they're ready to do the thing that they're being assessed on. So it's demonstrating middle grade readiness, and we're doing it now because trainees in Progress Plus are going to be moving to middle grade before they have their clinical exam. So because the clinical exam is now needs to be a requirement by the end of ST4, we need to have some way of demonstrating that a trainee is ready to move up to the middle grade rota. So it's looking at things like it's looking at registrar type activities, so an acute take, neonatal admission, covering an assessment unit, for example, and it's already available, and some trainees are using it already, and I think it's a really good tool, and it will be the thing to demonstrate middle grade readiness. So it needs to be observed and assessed by a consultant, and it's basically deciding whether a trainee is ready to be independent on the rota. So this is what it looks like, just because I took some screenshots of this before. So your ECAT, you can select various different topics, and then it asks you to fill in certain bits of the domains. Some of them are not so specific, and you might not need to fill them in, but some of them are mandatory filling in options, but you may be able to add in to other areas that may be relevant during that assessment. And you're then going to talk about what went well, so areas for development, and then at the bottom is the sort of the most important area, which is, are they ready to progress? And it will come up with a couple of options, which is can't undertake unsupervised with remote supervision, or can or can't, basically. And therefore, obviously, if you feel that they're not ready, then you need further input to get them ready to that level, and then think about doing another ECAT to demonstrate that they are ready. As Michaela said, there's a progression form for independent working. So with Progress Plus, middle grade working happens at ST, at the moment ST4 in most places, in some places it's ST3, but there will be a requirement that trainees move up, maybe consider moving up a bit earlier if they're ready, and therefore we need some evidence from the supervisor that they are ready to do that, and that's what this form is for. So it supports is a support for the ARCP, and it requires ECATs to be done, and it needs to be signed off by the clinical supervisor in that area to say that they are ready to work. So if they're working in general peds, the clinical supervisor would sign them off to say that they are ready. And you can see this is what it looks like. Well, this is an old version, I think, that I have, what it looks like. So it's about readiness for Tier 2 working. And again, it's a bit like the supervision report. You can see that it will generate evidence there that demonstrates that they are ready to work at middle grade. And you can see at the bottom it says clinical supervision declaration. So you will need to be discussing feedback from other colleagues. So if you have regular supervision meetings, or your own observation to say that they are ready. So just in the last 10 minutes, I was just asked to promote, and as a START assessor myself, promote START. So as an excellent, as an ES or a college tutor, is that now sharing? I think it should be. Yes. So one of the roles as an educational supervisor is to support your trainee in their PDP, so their PDP post-START. So obviously, I hope everybody knows what START is. So that is it's not an exam, it's an assessment at the end, sort of ST7, 8, usually ST7, to make sure that trainees are fit for working as a first day consultant, and it's not an exam, but there is development points that come out of that for trainees to improve before they become a consultant and ready. And therefore, following your START assessment, a PDP will be created. So they'll get a form, and hopefully a lot of you know about this already, but they will get some feedback from their START assessment, and it needs to then go to you as the educational supervisor to look at what those requirements from the START was and create a PDP, and those are areas that they need to address before they're ready to be a consultant and get their CCT sign off. So obviously if there are significant concerns, those need to be addressed. There may be further developments, and there may be bits from all the scenarios, but it's teasing out which bits the trainee needs to do as a priority, and then and those bits that they would like to focus on. So we're thinking about 2 or 3 goals as a max. Not all the suggestions from the start, by the way, are mandatory. So obviously if a trainee needs development, then those are the bits that they need to focus on. If a trainee gets from their start achieved, then it's felt that they are ready to be a consultant in that area. So there will be lots of feedback, because some of the feedback that comes back is the same for a lot of trainees. Consider doing this, consider doing that. Doesn't necessarily mean the trainee needs to do that. So trying to make that PDP with the trainee as their supervisor as smart as they can, not having too many things to do in the last year of their training. And I think that's really important, that you sit down with your trainee and go through their START and work out what they need to do to get their CCT. So just for people who don't know, START's been going for a while now. There are various, there's 2 diets a year, and there were 3 for a bit. There's 7 generic and 3 subspecialty specific scenarios, and we really need, the college really need more assessors. So if you feel you'd like to look into it, then obviously you can see the START at rcpch.act.uk web email address, and we can put that in the chat. or there's Shri, who is the chair of START, who unfortunately can't be here today. If you want to get involved in generating scenarios, also opportunity for senior trainees to get involved, then again contact the START. So the only other thing to say is that if you are keen, these are the next times for the next START assessments, and what they do is and I've just only become a START assessor myself, and I went on a training session for a morning going through how to be an assessor, and then you can get to observe and then be on the and then do the START assessment, and it's really it's not complicated, but it's a really fun and enjoyable thing to do, talking to trainees about how they would manage cases and things. It's much less, it's not like doing exams, so it is like a conversation. It's basically a glorified CBD as an assessment. So if you are keen, here are the dates, and we can send out this information, can't we, afterwards. And then finally, I think Anthony was going to share a video, weren't you, Anthony, about longitudinal supervision?
Perfect. Okay, I'll play through that video now. Thank you.
What is longitudinal educational supervision? It's the process of having one educational supervisor for a longer period of time than you may have been used to having. So maybe a year or so. I have been having this experience for quite a while in my training so far, and I found it so useful. I've had one educational supervisor from ST4 to 5 and another educational supervisor who's been consistent for ST6 onwards. And this has covered some really key points in my career in terms of subspecialty applications and going through my subspecialty training. What do I think the benefits of having a consistent educational supervisor are? For me, the main benefit comes when you have your supervision meetings, which I think sometimes can be seen like a bit of a job or a bit of a chore. But when you have an educational supervisor who knows you, then they just become so much more useful. Those meetings push you forward and they become a meeting to make progress and make plans for the future, instead of a meeting going back over what you did last time and who you are, what your name is and what stage of training you're at. So I've just found those meetings so much more useful now because I know who I'm going to talk to and what we're going to talk about. Other benefits I found are that she's gotten to know me on a slightly more holistic level. She's got an idea of, you know, what I'm doing outside of work, how my family affects my ability to work, etc. And so it's so nice to come to a meeting where someone asks kind of how you are and actually wants to know the answer. So again, I just think that puts a much nicer tone on all meetings when it feels like a nice professional conversation instead of an assessment. Having one supervisor has also meant that she's gotten to understand and help me develop my special interest areas and then help me identify projects in those areas and network around it. And again, all of this I feel just is going to give me so much help when it comes towards the end of my training when I have to think about what to do post CCT. I think having one consistent educational supervisor taking all the feedback about you from your department, again, just really adds weight to things like your multi-source feedback. And when a supervisor gives you feedback to suggest that maybe you do something a little bit differently, it really holds a lot more weight when you know that, you know, potentially this is consistent feedback they've received as opposed to a one-off. Overall, I found having one consistent educational supervisor to be a really great thing. I think if you don't have it, then that's absolutely fine, and there are positives to that too. But actually having one person who knows you, who's rooting for you and who's trying to encourage you and support you through the training program, I think is an excellent idea. So bringing that forward more strongly in Progress Plus, I think will only be beneficial for paediatric trainees moving forward.
Lovely, thank you, Anthony. I think that was a really powerful presentation, isn't it, from a trainee about the longitudinal supervision. I know that some areas do it already and it works well, but for those areas I think that don't, that presentation from that trainee highlights the importance of it and why it's in Progress Plus.